December 4th, 1950. The morning had started cold and clear, the kind of bitter Korean winter day where the air itself seemed to crystallize. High above the northeastern reaches of the Korean peninsula, at 3,500 feet, an F-4U-4 Corsair fighter aircraft, bearing the number 32 on its fuselage, suddenly banked hard to the right. Black smoke billowed from behind the engine cowling, streaming back in thick, oily tendrils that marked the sky with an ominous trail. This wasn't enemy fire. It was the engine itself dying, tearing apart from within, metal grinding against metal in its final violent convulsions. Inside the cramped cockpit, 24-year-old Navy Lieutenant Jesse Brown felt the abnormal vibration through the control stick, a sickening shudder that traveled up his arms and into his chest. The engine RPM gauge needle was jumping erratically, dancing across the dial in a way that made his stomach tighten with dread. The oil temperature was climbing rapidly, the needle sweeping past the critical red line and continuing upward into territory no pilot ever wanted to see. The oil pressure gauge told an equally grim story, dropping fast, bleeding away the lifeblood that kept the massive radio engine functioning. Every pilot knew what that meant. The Pratt & Whitney MiDus 2800 double wasp engine, a magnificent piece of engineering capable of producing 2,250 horsepower under normal circumstances, was entering its death throes. Without oil pressure, the 18 cylinders would seize within minutes, maybe seconds. 2,000 yards to his right and slightly behind, Lieutenant Thomas Huttner was witnessing it all unfold. The 26-year-old from Fall River, Massachusetts, came from a comfortable, middle-class family. He and Jesse Brown both belonged to VF-32 Squadron, nicknamed the Swordsman. Through his canopy, Huttner could see Brown's aircraft starting to trail burning oil, the droplets freezing in the -35-degree air at altitude, creating a deadly black trail of crystallized death markers. "Tom, I've got engine failure." Brown's voice crackled through the radio, tension evident despite his attempt to stay calm. Oil pressures dropping fast. Huttner immediately pushed his stick forward, closing the distance to Brown's struggling aircraft. Through his canopy, he could see the oil streaming from underneath the fuselage, leaving that ominous dark streak against the white landscape far below. "Jesse, head for the coast. Try to make it near the carrier. I've got you covered." Below them stretched the most brutal battlefield of the Korean War, the Chosin Reservoir. At that very moment, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army's 9th Army Group was launching a massive assault against the U.S. 1st Marine Division. The temperature had plummeted to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, transforming this battle into a frowning hell on earth. Brown's aircraft continued its inexorable descent. 3,000 feet, 2,800 feet. The engine's coughing grew more pronounced, more desperate. This was the sound of a Pratt & Whitney Renus 2,800 engine on the verge of complete failure. A sound every pilot dreaded. The coastline lay 35 miles distant. If he could just hold on until then, there'd be a chance. Helicopter rescue. A shot at survival. But Brown's Corsair was losing altitude at 400 feet per minute. At this rate, simple mathematics told a grim story. He wouldn't make it. At 2,400 feet, the engine erupted in a violent metallic shriek. The entire engine cowling began shaking violently. One of the cylinders in the Pratt & Whitney had catastrophically failed. "Tom, I can't control it anymore. I have to put her down." The words every wingman dreads hearing. Below stretched a snow-covered valley, -40 degrees, Chinese-controlled territory. A crash landing here meant even if you survived the impact, you'd face capture or freezing to death within minutes. "Don't bail out, Jesse. Find someplace relatively flat to set her down. I'm calling in rescue." Huttner's voice remained steady, but he knew the brutal reality. The nearest American ground forces were 15 miles away, locked in savage combat. They couldn't spare anyone. At 1,800 feet, Brown began searching for a landing spot. The terrain below was unforgiving. Steep mountain slopes, dense pine forests, scattered farmland, all blanketed in thick snow. he spotted a relatively open hillside, maybe 15 degrees of slope. No obvious rocks visible through the snow. It was the only option. At 1,200 feet, Brown began executing the emergency landing procedure. Gear up. To prevent it from catching and flipping the aircraft during the slide. Canopy open. To ensure he could escape after impact. Safety harness tight to survive the tremendous force of hitting the ground. Huttner stayed glued to Brown's right rear quarter, maintaining 500 yards separation. His eyes continuously scanned the surrounding area, alert for any anti-aircraft fire from Chinese positions. 800 feet, 600, 400. Brown's Corsair lined up with a snowy slope, nose slightly elevated, trying to bleed off as much airspeed as possible before impact. The collision was more violent than anyone could have imagined. The 2.8-ton fighter, carrying 80 knots of forward speed, slammed into the snow-covered hillside with tremendous force. The airframe buckled like it had been hit with a giant sledgehammer, aluminum skin crumpling, rivets popping like gunfire. The forward section buried itself deep into the snow, the nose cone collapsing inward. The propeller blades sheared off instantly against frosting ground. 3 massive fragments of tempered steel spinning through the air like deadly shrapnel. The engine cowling tore open, exposing the still smoking Pratt & Whitney engine. Oil and hydraulic fluid spraying in all directions. The aircraft skidded across the snow, carving a long furrow in the hillside, throwing up massive walls of snow on either side. The friction created an unholy shriek of tortured metal grinding against ice. Snow exploded upward in a massive white column that rose 50 feet into the air. After sliding roughly 200 yards, gouging a scar across the landscape, the plane finally came to rest at an awkward angle, the tail section jutting up unnaturally. Huttner, circling overhead, had watched the entire sequence. Jesses, do you read me? Only harsh static answered. Huttner dropped to 1,000 feet and began a slow orbit. He could see the Corsair with its forward section buried deep in snow. The canopy was still open, but no one was climbing out. He completed another circle. Still, no movement. Huttner's heart sank. The impact might have knocked Brown unconscious. Or worse, he could be critically injured, unable to move. 2 minutes had passed since the crash landing. At -40 degrees, an unconscious person's body temperature would plummet at a terrifying rate. Huttner had to make a decision. Continue circling, waiting for rescue, or land and attempt to help. The nearest helicopter Saturday on a carrier 40 miles away. It would take at least 25 minutes to arrive. Brown wouldn't last that long. And this was enemy territory. Chinese troops could arrive at any moment. Once they did, Brown would either be captured or killed. Huttner glanced at his fuel gauge. 45 minutes remaining. More than enough to return to the carrier. He looked down at that snow-covered hillside. F-4U Corsair fighters had never been trained for snow landings. No one knew what would happen. His mind drifted back 3 months to the Marine Corps base at Camp Lejeune, to a conversation with Brown right after they'd both qualified for carrier operations. You know, Tom, Brown had said, it took me twice as long to earn these wings, not because I couldn't fly as well as anyone else, but because of the color of my skin. Jesse Brown was the first African-American aviator in United States Navy history, a distinction that came with a heavy price in an era when racial segregation was still legally enforced across much of America. Every single step of his journey had been exponentially harder than everyone else's. Flight school instructors had openly stated that black men lacked the intelligence and temperament to become pilots. Brown had proven them devastatingly wrong with perfect flying performance. During his training at Naval Air Station Pensacola, the inequities were stark. White cadets lived in base housing. Brown had to stay at the only hotel in town that would accept black guests, driving 20 miles each way, every single day, regardless of weather or how early the briefings started. Someone had scrawled racial slurs on his flight suit. People threw rocks through his quarters windows at night. He received anonymous threats warning that accidents might happen during training if he didn't quit voluntarily. The threats were terrifying, but never specific enough to investigate. But Brown never backed down. He worked harder than everyone else. He logged 30% more flight hours than his peers. His gunnery scores topped the class. His formation flying was flawless. Finally, on October 21st, 1948, the Navy awarded him his Golden Aviator's wings in Rhode Island. That day, Brown's wife Daisy and their daughter Pam sat in the front row of the ceremony. Daisy cried for 10 straight minutes. Hutner came from a wealthy white family. His father was a successful businessman. He'd attended Phillips Exeter Academy, one of the nation's most elite prep schools, then Harvard University. Everything had come naturally, easily, but in VFINA's 32 Squadron, he and Brown had become close friends, not out of pity, but out of respect. Respect for Brown's flying skills, respect for his professionalism, respect for his courage in overcoming impossible odds. On the carrier, many white officers avoided sitting at the same mess table with Brown. Hutner always made a point of sitting beside him. They discussed tactics together. They maintained their aircraft together. They stood together on the flight deck, waiting for launch orders. Brown once told him, "Tom, you don't need to make a show of being friendly. I don't want to be your burden." Hutner had replied, "Jesse, you're one of the best pilots I've ever flown with. Flying with you is an honor, not a burden." Now that friend lay in enemy territory, buried in snow, his fate unknown. Hutner made his decision. He pressed the radio transmit button. "This is Swordsman, lead 304. I'm going in to attempt rescue. Request immediate helicopter support. Cottondards, 40 degrees, 21 minutes north, 127 degrees, 5 minutes east." The flight leader's voice came back, shock evident. 304. "Confirm, you're in enemy territory." "Confirmed, I can't leave him alone out there." After a pause, the response came, "God be with you, Tom. Rescue helo estimated 25 minutes out." Hutner began his descent, carefully studying Brown's crash path. He selected the same snowy slope, but offset about 300 yards to the north. 1,000 feet, 800, 600. Hutner retracted his landing gear, opened his canopy, tightened his harness. He took a deep breath. The snow-covered ground rushed up to meet him. He could make out individual pine trees, individual rocks. 400 feet, 200, 100. Impact. The entire world shook violently. Hutner's head snapped forward, slamming into the instrument panel. Blood immediately streamed from his forehead, blurring his vision. The aircraft careened wildly across the snow, skidding out of control, swaying left and right. Snow waves surged up on both sides, battering the cockpit. The slide went far longer than expected. The fighter headed straight for a tree line. Hutner desperately tried to steer, but control was impossible. Just before smashing into the trees, the aircraft finally stopped. The right wingtip Saturday, just 5 feet from the nearest pine tree. Hutner gasped for breath, quickly checking himself for injuries. Besides the forehead gash, nothing else seemed broken. He unbuckled his harness, stumbled out of the cockpit. The instant his feet hit the snow, bone-piercing cold struck him. -, 40 degrees. At this temperature, exposed skin would suffer frostbite within 2 minutes, complete hypothermia, and death within 30 minutes. Hutner began running toward Brown's aircraft. The snow came up to his knees. Each step required tremendous effort. His flight boots filled with snow. Flight suits weren't designed for extreme cold. The 300-yard distance took him 5 full minutes of exhausting struggle. When he finally reached Brown's plane, he was gasping for air, sweat freezing instantly into ice on his forehead. "Jesse, Jesses." No response. Hutner climbed up onto the wreckage. What he saw in the cockpit made his heart seize. Brown was alive, but trapped firmly in the cockpit. The impact had twisted and deformed the forward fuselage, pinning both his legs. Blood seeped from his knees, staining his flight suit crimson. Brown's eyes opened. Seeing Hutner, he managed a weak smile. "Tom, you crazy son of a bitch. You actually landed. Don't talk. Save your strength. I'm getting you out of here." Hutner began trying to pull Brown free, wrapping his arms around his friend's torso, planting his feet for leverage, pulling with all his strength. But it was utterly impossible. The metal airframe, bent by the tremendous impact, gripped Brown's legs like a steel vise. The cockpit sides had buckled inward, creating a prison of crumpled aluminum. Hutner pulled until his muscles screamed, until his vision blurred. Nothing, not even a millimeter of movement. Brown's face had gone deathly pale from blood loss and the unrelenting cold. The cockpit offered no shelter. Frigid wind at -40 degrees poured in without mercy, stealing body heat faster than Brown's metabolism could generate it. His lips were turning blue. His body temperature was dropping rapidly toward the point of no return. Hutner jumped down and began frantically searching for anything that could serve as a tool. He found a piece of metal about 2 feet long and began trying to pry his friend free. The metal had become incredibly hard in the extreme cold. Hutner threw his full weight onto the improvised pry bar, muscles straining. His fingers bled where the sharp edges cut through his gloves, but the wreckage wouldn't budge. He tried for 10 agonizing minutes, changing angles, refusing to accept defeat. No progress. Tom, stop. You need to go, Brown said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper, each word requiring tremendous effort. Hutner ignored him, continuing to pry desperately at the unyielding metal, refusing to accept what both of them already knew in their hearts. Brown's voice grew even fainter, his strength ebbing with each passing second. Listen to me. When the helicopter gets here, you need to get on it. Don't stay here for me. Don't throw your life away for nothing. Shut up. Jess says, I'm not leaving you. Not now. Not ever. But even as Hutner spoke the words, both men knew the brutal, inescapable truth. Brown was trapped too tightly. The wreckage compressed around him with thousands of pounds of force. Without professional cutting equipment, hydraulic jaws, acetylene torches, tools that existed on aircraft carriers and in repair facilities, but nowhere near this godforsaken hillside. Extraction was physically impossible. It wasn't a matter of trying harder or wanting it more. It was simple, cruel physics. 15 minutes had passed since the crash, each one an eternity. Hutner's fingers were frozen absolutely solid, ice crystals forming on his gloves. His cheeks had lost all feeling, the flesh going waxy and white. The first stage of frostbite. His body had begun shivering uncontrollably, violent tremors that made his teeth chatter. The early symptoms of hypothermia setting in, his core temperature beginning its fatal decline. Just then, the low rumble of engine sounds echoed up from the valley below, a sound that didn't belong to any American aircraft, not a helicopter, not a rescue vehicle. Trucks, Soviet-made engines with their distinctive diesel rattle. Hutner looked toward the valley, his heart sinking. 3 Soviet-made gaseous trucks, their canvas-covered beds packed with soldiers, were grinding their way up the narrow mountain road, following the cloud of smoke and debris that marked the crash site like a beacon. Distance, approximately 2,000 yards, maybe 1.25 miles. At their current speed, navigating the treacherous snowy road, maybe 5 minutes, certainly no more than 8, until arrival, until Chinese troops would be here with their rifles, their orders, their understandable desire to capture or kill down the enemy pilots. Jesse, you see them. They're coming. Brown nodded. Tom, take my sidearm. Then leave. That's an order. No. Jesse Brown summoned every remaining ounce of strength left in his failing body, every last reserve of willpower, to grab Hutner's hand with a grip that was surprisingly, desperately strong for a dying man. His fingers, cold as ice, wrapped around Hutner's wrist with urgent intensity. Listen to me, Tom. I've spent my entire life, every single day since I was old enough to understand what skin color meant in this country, fighting to prove that a black man can do anything a white man can do. Not just do it better. Do it with more skill, more dedication, more heart. I succeeded, Tom, against every obstacle they put in my way, every closed door, every insult, every threat. I succeeded. I made it into the sky when they said it was impossible. I flew combat missions when they said black men didn't have the courage. I fought for my country, for this imperfect nation that didn't always fight for me, and I did it with honor. I lived with dignity when they tried to strip that away from me at every turn. Brown's voice was fading now, each word requiring monumental effort, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Now I'm going to die. Tom, I know it. You know it, but I don't want. I refuse to let my death to mean yours too. You have to survive this. You have to make it back. Live to tell everyone who will listen, that we flew together as brothers, that when it mattered most, when everything was on the line, skin color meant nothing. Only the man inside mattered. Tell Daisy, I love her more than life itself. Tell Pam, her daddy fought for something bigger than himself. Tell them I died like a warrior, like an aviator, like a man who never backed down. Tell them I died free. Tears welled in Hotner's eyes, freezing instantly into ice on his cheeks. I can't leave you like this. At that moment, the roar of helicopter rotors filled the air, and Hal 3's helicopter was approaching fast, circling overhead. But the pilot quickly realized the problem. The area was too small. Surrounded by trees, the helicopter couldn't land, and the Chinese trucks were now less than 1,000 yards away. The helicopter pilot's urgent voice crackled through the radio. Swordsman, Lieutenant, you must evacuate immediately. Enemy forces arriving in 2 minutes. I cannot land. You need to run to the clearing north of your position. I'll pick you up there. Hutner looked at Brown. Brown used his last reserves of energy to speak. Go, now. Hutner knelt in the snow. He draped his own flight jacket over Brown, pulled out his sidearm, and placed it within Brown's reach. I'm sorry, Jess. I'm so sorry. Brown couldn't speak anymore. He just nodded. Hutner turned and ran north. Every step felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Not from the cold, but from guilt. Chinese gunfire erupted behind him. Bullets kicked up white spray in the snow around him. The helicopter began suppressing fire, the door gunner raking the ground with his .30 caliber machine gun. Hutner dove into the helicopter. The pilot immediately pulled up, rotor wash kicking up a massive snow cloud. As they climbed, Hutner took one last look at Brown's aircraft. Chinese soldiers were closing in, but Brown's figure had already disappeared into the snow fog. The helicopter headed for the ocean. Towards safety, Hutner sat in the cabin, weeping uncontrollably. At 6:15 p.m. on December 4th, the U.S. military confirmed that Navy Lieutenant Jesse Brown had been killed in action in the Chosin Reservoir region of Korea. He was 24 years old. 3 days later, on the flight deck of the USS Leyte, Thomas Hutner was awarded the Navy Cross, the second to highest military decoration in the United States Navy, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor. Fleet Admiral personally pinned the medal on his chest during the ceremony. The citation read, demonstrating extraordinary valor beyond the call of duty by deliberately crash landing in enemy territory in an attempt to rescue a fellow aviator, knowing full well the mission would likely result in his own death. Hutner stood at attention to receive the honor, but felt no joy whatsoever. He believed he didn't deserve this medal because he had failed to save Jesse. After the ceremony, he returned to his quarters and wrote a long letter to Jesse's widow. Daisy. In it, he described in detail everything that had happened that day. How brave Jesse had been. How professional. How strong. He wrote, Daisy, I cannot forgive myself. I failed to save him. I will spend the rest of my life honoring his memory, ensuring the world knows Jesse Brown was a hero, not because of his skin color, but because of his character. After the war ended, Hutner chose not to remain in the Navy or return to the business world. Instead, he entered public service. In 1971, President Nixon appointed him Deputy Administrator of the Veterans Administration, specifically to improve treatment for minority veterans. In the 1980s, he actively pushed for a warship to be named after Jesse Brown. In 1973, the USS Jesse L. Brown, the first United States Navy ship named for an African American, was commissioned as a frigate. In 2017, Thomas Hutner died in Massachusetts at the age of 91. At his funeral, the crowd paying respects included former squadron mates, veterans, and civil rights activists. His coffin was draped with the American flag and his Navy Cross, but positioned closest to his heart was a yellowed photograph. It showed two young aviators standing in front of an F-4U Corsair, smiling broadly, one white, one black. The sky behind them, brilliant blue. Daisy Brown, until her death in 2005, sent Hutner a Christmas card every single year. The message was always the same. Thank you for trying. Thank you for not letting him die alone. And Hutner's reply was always the same. I owe him a debt I can never repay. On that hillside, at the Chosin Reservoir, at -40 degrees, the friendship between two aviators transcended race, transcended death, transcended time itself. It wasn't just about comradeship. It was about upholding human dignity, practicing the ideal of equality, defining what brotherhood truly means. Jesse Brown proved with his life that a black man could be just as excellent a pilot, just as brave a warrior, just as worthy of respect as anyone else. And Thomas Hutner proved with his actions that true friendship sees not skin color, but the soul within. In 2018, the U.S. Navy produced a documentary titled For Jesse, interviewing survivors from that era and recreating that frozen winter day. At the film's conclusion, elderly aviators stood before the USS Jesse L. Brown, saluting that pioneer. They said, when Jesse flew, the sky didn't distinguish between black and white, only between aviator and aviator, comrade and comrade, brother and brother. In 2020, a film called Devotion was released, telling the story of Brown and Hutner. At the premiere screening, Brown's daughter Pam, now 72 years old, watched for the first time a recreation of her father's final moments. When it ended, she told reporters, "My father never saw me grow up, never saw the victories of the civil rights movement, never saw a black president elected. But his sacrifice was one of the foundation stones that made all of that possible. He proved to the world that black people are not second-to-class citizens. We are complete, equal, deserving of respect." And Lieutenant Hutner's choice proved that some people were ready to cross that dividing line, to see the person, not the pigmentation. That is what truly happened on that cold December 4th, 1950, on a snowy hillside at Chosin Reservoir. Two fighter aircraft, two aviators, one white, one black, one lived, one died. But their stories are forever intertwined. Those who flew these missions understand a bond most of us will never comprehend. They flew into enemy fire because someone had to. They deliberately crash-landed because brothers never face death alone. Skin color may differ, background may differ, but when one person is willing to risk death for another, willing to fly deliberately into the jaws of mortality, in that moment they transcend all differences and become true brothers. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel to honor all those who fought for equality and freedom. Tell me in the comments, do you think Hutner made the right choice? If you were in his position, would you have done the same? Share this story with your friends so more people learn Jesse Brown's name and Thomas Hutner's decision. Let these heroes' deeds never be forgotten, because their sacrifice purchased the freedom we enjoy today. Their courage illuminated the path toward equality, and that snowy hillside at Chosin Reservoir will forever remember that day when the sky knew no color, only brothers.